The cold morning air carried the scent of damp pavement and discarded waste as Jake steered his garbage truck down the familiar route. He had been a sanitation worker for years, used to early mornings and the rhythmic clatter of bins being emptied. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to witness. As he slowed in front of a modest brick house, he noticed a woman standing by the curb, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her eyes were red and puffy, her breath uneven as she struggled to push a large trash bag toward the street. Something about her seemed off, almost fragile, like she might break apart at any moment. Jake had seen all kinds of people on his route, but rarely did anyone look this devastated while taking out the trash. He hopped down from his truck and offered a polite nod. "Morning, ma'am. You okay?" The woman didn't answer right away. She hesitated, glancing toward the garbage can she had just dragged to the curb. Her lip trembled as she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Just getting rid of some things." Something about the way she said it sent a shiver up Jake's spine. He had a job to do, though, so he pulled on his gloves and hoisted the bag into the compactor. The hydraulics hissed as the metal crusher engaged, pressing the trash down with immense force. Then he heard it, a faint, muffled sound, almost like a whimper. Jake froze. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he turned to the woman, but she had already stepped back, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern. The woman looked away, wiping her hands on her sweater. I don't know," she stammered. "Maybe just something shifting in the bag." But Jake wasn't convinced. He had been doing this job long enough to know the difference between shifting garbage and something alive. Panic surged through him as he hit the emergency stop button on the truck. The machine groaned to a halt. Without thinking, he lunged toward the compactor, yanking at the still-crushing pile of trash. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that something about this wasn't right. Then, as he pulled apart the layers of crushed waste, he saw it. Something small. Something fragile. And it was moving. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he realized what was in the trash, what had almost been destroyed forever. He turned back to the woman, his eyes wide with shock. Her tears were falling freely now, her hands shaking at her sides. "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered. Jake barely registered her words. His hands were still trembling as he reached down, hoping, praying that it wasn't too late. And in that moment he knew this was no ordinary day on the job. Jake's hands trembled as he carefully pulled the torn trash bag apart, his heart racing faster with each passing second. The small, fragile thing inside shifted again, letting out another faint, muffled sound. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear straight through him. He'd never felt anything like this on the job before. His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. As he peeled back the last layer of crushed paper and plastic, his breath caught in his throat. Lying there, crumpled but still moving, was a tiny bundle wrapped in a thin, stained blanket. His eyes widened in disbelief. It was a baby, bruised, cold, but alive. For a split second, everything around him faded. The hum of the truck, the morning chill, even the woman's quiet sobs behind him. All Jake could focus on was the fragile life in his hands. He gently cradled the baby, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. How had this child ended up in the trash? And why had this woman, this crying, broken woman, tried to throw it away? Jake turned sharply, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "What is this? What were you thinking?" His words came out harsher than he intended, but he couldn't help it. The weight of the situation was too much. The woman's face crumpled as she covered her mouth, tears streaming down her cheeks. I didn't mean to," she choked out, her voice breaking with every word. "I didn't know what else to do." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know whether to call the police, an ambulance, or both. But something about the woman's raw, desperate expression made him pause. This wasn't just some heartless act, there was more to the story. He could feel it. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone softer now but still laced with urgency. "Who is this baby?" The woman sank to her knees on the cold pavement, her arms wrapped tightly around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. She shook her head, her sobs growing louder. It's not what you think," she whispered. Jake's mind was spinning. He glanced down at the baby, who let out a weak, wheezing cry. The sound snapped him back to reality. There was no time to waste. Whatever this woman's story was, the baby needed help now. He pulled out his phone with one hand, the other still cradling the tiny bundle against his chest. As he dialed 911, he kept his eyes on the woman. She didn't move. She just sat there, staring at the ground, her face pale and hollow like the life had been drained out of her. The dispatcher picked up, and Jake quickly explained the situation. "I found a baby in the trash compactor," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "It's alive, but barely. I need an ambulance. Fast." As he gave the address, he could hear sirens wailing in the distance. But even as help was on the way, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something about this whole situation was deeply wrong. The woman wasn't trying to run or deny what had happened. She looked lost, like she was just as shocked as he was. When he hung up, Jake crouched down beside her. "Look," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. "Help is coming, but you need to tell me what's going on. Why was that baby in the trash?" The woman finally met his eyes, and what Jake saw in them wasn't malice or guilt, it was fear. Pure, bone-deep fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could get the words out, the sound of screeching tires filled the air. A dark car pulled up at the end of a street, its windows tinted so dark Jake couldn't see inside. The woman's face went even paler. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with panic. I have to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake grabbed her arm gently but firmly. "No, you're not going anywhere until you tell me what's going on." But the woman was already pulling away, her eyes darting nervously toward the car. Jake could feel it now. This wasn't just some tragic accident. There was something bigger at play, something dangerous. And whatever it was, it had just arrived. The dark car idled at the end of a street, its engine humming low like a warning. Jake could feel the tension crackling in the air, thick enough to choke on. The woman's eyes darted from the baby in his arms to the car, her whole body trembling like she was about to bolt. "Who is that?" Jake hissed, tightening his grip on her arm just enough to keep her from running. "Do you know them?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes filled with fresh tears, and she shook her head as if denying the truth would make it go away. But Jake could see it. The fear in her eyes wasn't just about what had happened with the baby. It was about whoever was in that car. The baby let out another soft, pitiful cry against Jake's chest, snapping him back to the urgency of the moment. He could hear the distant wail of sirens growing closer, but his focus was locked on the car. It hadn't moved, but Jake felt like the people inside were watching, waiting. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice but keeping it firm. "Help is almost here. You need to tell me what's happening right now." The woman swallowed hard, her breath ragged. "They'll hurt me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "If they see me talking to you, they'll—" She cut herself off, glancing nervously back at the car. Jake's mind raced. Whoever they were, it was clear this wasn't just about a desperate mother abandoning her child. There was something bigger going on, something dangerous. The car's engine suddenly revved, and Jake's heart jumped. For a second, he thought they were about to speed off, but instead, the car crept forward, rolling slowly down the street like a predator stalking its prey. Jake instinctively stepped in front of the woman, shielding her with his body while still holding the baby close. "You need to go inside," he whispered urgently. "Now! Lock the door and don't open it for anyone but the cops." The woman hesitated, her eyes wide with terror, but then she nodded and stumbled toward her house. Jake watched her disappear inside, the door slamming shut behind her. He turned his attention back to the car, his pulse hammering in his ears. Just as the car reached the curb, the sirens blared around the corner. Red and blue lights flashed against the houses, and the car suddenly sped off, tires screeching as it disappeared down the street. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding, but the relief was short-lived. Whoever was in that car wasn't gone for good. He could feel it. The ambulance pulled up moments later, and paramedics rushed out. Jake handed the baby over, his hands shaking from a mix of adrenaline and fear. The baby let out a weak cry as they placed it on a stretcher and checked its vitals. One of the paramedics, a woman with kind eyes, glanced at Jake. "You saved this baby's life," she said softly. "If you hadn't stopped that compactor." Jake nodded numbly, his mind still spinning. "Is the baby going to be okay?" "We're taking them to the hospital now," she replied. "It looks like they've got some bruising, but they're breathing. That's a good sign." As the ambulance pulled away, a police officer approached Jake. He was tall, with a sharp gaze that flicked between Jake and the house. "We got the call," the officer said, pulling out a notebook. "Mind telling me what happened here?" Jake recounted everything. Finding the baby, the woman's reaction, the mysterious car. The officer's expression grew darker with every word. "We're going to need to talk to the woman inside," the officer said, nodding toward the house. Jake hesitated. "She's scared. Whoever was in that car, she knows them. She thinks they're going to hurt her." The officer's jaw tightened. "We'll keep her safe, but if there's something more going on here, we need to know." As the officer and his partner headed toward the house, Jake stayed by his truck, watching the scene unfold. His hands were still shaking, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The woman had said it wasn't what he thought. But if it wasn't, then what was it? And who was willing to risk everything to keep it a secret? As the police knocked on the door, Jake's eyes drifted back down the street, half expecting the dark car to reappear. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. And Jake had a sinking feeling he was already in deeper than he'd ever intended. The police officer stood at the woman's door, knocking firmly. Jake watched from the edge of his truck, his heart still racing. The woman took a long time to answer, and for a moment, Jake wondered if she'd somehow slipped out the back. But then the door creaked open, and she appeared, her face pale, eyes swollen from crying. She hesitated before letting them in, glancing nervously down the street as if expecting that dark car to reappear at any moment. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking just out of sight. The baby was safe for now, but nothing about this felt over. The tension clung to the air like humidity before a storm. The woman knew more than she was saying, and whoever was in that car wasn't finished with her. Minutes dragged by as the officer spoke with her inside. Jake paced near his truck, glancing up and down the quiet neighborhood street. It was too calm, too still, like the world was holding its breath. The garbage route, his normal routine, felt like a distant memory now. He wasn't just a garbage man anymore, he was caught in the middle of something dangerous, something way bigger than him. Suddenly, the front door burst open, and one of the officers shouted into his radio. Jake's heart jumped as he saw the woman stumble out onto the porch, her face white with terror. "They're here," she gasped, her voice hoarse. "They're back." Jake whipped his head around just in time to see the same dark car screeching back onto the street, tires squealing as it barreled toward the house. The engine roared louder this time, more aggressive, more desperate. Jake's breath caught in his throat. They weren't just here to scare her. They were here to finish what they started. "Get down!" one of the officers shouted, drawing his weapon and taking cover behind the patrol car. But the woman froze on the porch, her eyes locked on the speeding car like a deer caught in headlights. Jake didn't think, he just moved. Sprinting across the yard, he grabbed her arm and yanked her to the ground just as the car swerved onto the curb. The front bumper missed them by inches, slamming into the porch steps with a bone-rattling crash. The officer shouted commands, but the car's doors flew open before they could react. Two figures jumped out, both wearing dark hoodies pulled low over their faces. One of them held something in his hand. Jake couldn't see what it was, but the glint of metal made his stomach drop. Everything happened in a blur. The officers shouted again, but the figures didn't stop. One of them lunged toward the woman, while the other circled toward the side of the house, disappearing from view. Jake could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, the adrenaline blinding him to everything except the immediate danger. The officer closest to them fired a warning shot into the air, the sharp crack echoing through the neighborhood. But the figure didn't flinch. He grabbed the woman's wrist, yanking her to her feet with terrifying force. She screamed, struggling against his grip, but he was stronger, dragging her toward the car like a rag doll. Jake didn't think. He couldn't. His body moved on instinct. He lunged forward, tackling the man from behind, sending them both sprawling onto the cold pavement. The woman fell with them, hitting the ground hard. Jake felt the man's elbow slam into his ribs, knocking the wind out of him, but he didn't let go. He grabbed at the man's hood, pulling it back, desperate to see his face. For a brief second, their eyes met. The man's face was sharp, gaunt, with a thin scar running down his cheek. But it wasn't just the scar that chilled Jake. It was the emptiness in his eyes, like there was no soul behind them. The man snarled and shoved Jake off, scrambling to his feet. But by then, the officers were on him. They wrestled him to the ground, pinning him with their knees as they cuffed his wrists. The woman lay on the ground, sobbing uncontrollably, her body shaking like she'd been shattered from the inside. But Jake barely had time to process any of it, because just as the first man was dragged toward the police car, a shout came from the side of the house. "He's got something!" The second figure reappeared, sprinting from the shadows with something tucked under his arm. Jake's blood ran cold as he realized what it was, the woman's purse. But why would he risk everything for that? The officer closest to the street gave chase, but the figure was fast, darting into the dark car still idling by the curb. The engine roared, and within seconds, the car peeled off down the street, disappearing around the corner before anyone could react. Jake stood there, breathless, watching the taillights vanish into the distance. The woman's sobs echoed in his ears, but his mind was racing with one thought. Whatever was in that purse, it wasn't just about money. It was the key to everything. And whoever those men were, they weren't done yet. The street was eerily quiet again, but the tension lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. Jake stood frozen, his heart pounding as he tried to piece together what had just happened. The woman was still on the ground, sobbing, while the officers worked to secure the man they'd arrested. But Jake's eyes stayed fixed on the empty street where the dark car had disappeared. Whoever that second man was, he hadn't just taken a purse. He'd taken something important, something worth risking everything for. An officer approached Jake, his face tight with concern. "You okay?" he asked, glancing at Jake's bruised ribs and scraped hands. Jake nodded, though his mind was miles away. "What was in her purse?" he asked, his voice low, still trying to make sense of it all. The officer shook his head. "We'll find out soon enough," he said, before turning back to the woman, who was now being helped to her feet. But Jake wasn't convinced it was that simple. There was something about the way the second man had focused on the purse, like it was the whole reason they'd come back. It wasn't just about silencing the woman or covering up the baby. There was something bigger at play. As the police led the woman inside to question her further, Jake hovered near the doorway, his curiosity burning hotter by the second. He knew he should probably leave, his shift had ended hours ago, and this was way beyond his job description, but something kept him there. He'd stumbled into something dark, and now he needed to see it through. Inside the house, the woman sat on the edge of her couch, her hands trembling as she clutched a blanket around her shoulders. The officer spoke to her in hushed tones, but Jake could hear enough to catch snippets of the conversation. "They're not going to stop," she whispered. "They'll come back. They always come back." "What were they after?" one officer pressed gently. "What's in that purse?" The woman hesitated, her eyes darting toward the window like she expected those dark figures to burst in at any moment. Finally, she took a shaky breath and whispered something so quietly Jake could barely hear. "It's not mine." The room went silent. The officer leaned in closer. "What do you mean it's not yours?" The woman wiped her eyes and stared down at her hands. "The baby, she's not mine either," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I found her in a dumpster behind my apartment." Jake felt his stomach drop. The baby wasn't hers? Then what was going on here? His mind raced, trying to connect the dots. "I was scared," the woman continued, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know what to do. But when I found her, there was a purse next to her. I thought maybe it belonged to the baby's mother. I didn't want to get involved, but I couldn't just leave her there. So I took both the baby and the purse, thinking I'd figure it out later. But then they started following me." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just some random act of desperation. She'd stumbled into something just like he had. But what was in that purse that was worth chasing her down? Before the officers could ask more questions, a call crackled over their radios. Jake watched as one of them stepped outside to respond. A few seconds later, he returned, his face pale. "We've got a problem," the officer announced. "That car, the one that took off, it was just found abandoned a few blocks away. But there's more. The purse wasn't in it, and there was no sign of the second guy." The room fell into stunned silence. Jake's thoughts spun faster. The guy hadn't even tried to hide the car. He wanted them to find it. But why? And where had he gone? As if on cue, the woman's phone buzzed from the coffee table. Everyone's eyes snapped to it. She picked it up hesitantly, her hands shaking so hard she almost dropped it. Jake could see the text notification flash across the screen, and his blood ran cold. "You should have left it where you found it. Now it's too late." The woman gasped, dropping the phone as if it had burned her. The officers quickly grabbed it, reading the message aloud. Jake's heart hammered in his chest. Whoever these people were, they weren't finished. And now they were making it clear, they knew exactly where she was. But before anyone could react, another buzz echoed through the room. This time it wasn't her phone. It was Jake's. He pulled it from his pocket, frowning at the unfamiliar number on the screen. His heart skipped a beat as he read the message. "You should have kept driving, garbage man. Now you're in it too." Jake stared at his phone, the message burning into his brain like a brand. "You should have kept driving, garbage man. Now you're in it too." His pulse pounded in his ears, and for the first time that night, real fear crept into his chest. Whoever these people were, they weren't just after the woman, they were after him now. The officers snapped into action, securing the house and calling for backup. But Jake knew that if these people wanted to get to them, they would. The abandoned car, the threatening messages, it was all part of a bigger plan. And Jake was starting to realize they were playing right into it. The woman, still trembling, sat on the couch, her eyes darting around the room like she expected the walls to cave in. "They're going to come back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They won't stop." Jake clenched his fists, his mind racing. He couldn't just sit here and wait. There had to be something they were missing. Something in the story that didn't add up. The baby, the purse, the dumpster. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Then it hit him. "The baby," Jake said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tense silence. The officers turned to him, frowning. "What if it's not about the purse at all? What if it's about the baby?" The woman's eyes widened, and for a moment, Jake thought she was going to deny it. But then she looked down at her hands, her shoulders slumping. "There was something," she whispered, "in the baby's blanket. I didn't look at it. I was too scared." Jake's heart raced. "What was it?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know. When I found her, the blanket felt heavy. But I was so focused on getting her out of there, I didn't think." Before she could finish, another officer burst through the door, his face pale. "We just got a call from the hospital. The baby, they found something sewn into her blanket." Jake's stomach twisted into knots. "What was it?" The officer hesitated, his eyes flicking to the woman before settling on Jake. "A flash drive." The room fell into stunned silence. Jake's mind raced. A flash drive? What could be so important that someone would risk everything to get it back? But before he could process it, the lights in the house flickered, and then went out. The room plunged into darkness, and a chilling silence settled over them. Jake's breath came in shallow gasps as he strained to hear anything. Footsteps, a car engine, something. But there was nothing. Then, from outside, a single shot rang out. The officers sprang into action, drawing their weapons and shouting commands. Jake grabbed the woman's hand, pulling her toward the back of the house. They stumbled through the dark, hearts pounding, as chaos erupted outside. They barely made it to the back door when it burst open, and the second man, the one who had taken the purse, stood there, his face shadowed but unmistakable. He wasn't holding a weapon this time. Instead, he held out the purse, his lips curling into a sinister smile. "You think this is about money?" he sneered, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea what you're caught up in." Jake stepped in front of the woman, his fists clenched. "Then why don't you tell me?" The man laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You're just a garbage man. You wouldn't understand." But before he could say more, a blinding light filled the room, and the officers burst in, tackling him to the ground. The woman collapsed into Jake's arms, sobbing with relief, as the officers cuffed the man and dragged him away. It was over. Or so Jake thought. Days later, after the dust had settled and the baby was safe in protective custody, Jake sat in his small apartment, staring at the news on his TV. The flash drive had been turned over to authorities, and what they found on it made his blood run cold. It wasn't just some random crime. The drive contained evidence of a massive trafficking ring. Names, transactions, locations. The baby had been a pawn, smuggled with the evidence by someone desperate to get it out. But they'd been found out, and the people behind it would stop at nothing to cover their tracks. The story made headlines, but what stuck with Jake wasn't the news or the arrests. It was the final twist that no one saw coming. A week after everything had happened, Jake received another message. "Thanks for helping us clean up. But remember, garbage man, some things are better left buried." Jake stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Whoever was behind this, they weren't finished. And neither was he. Jake sat on his worn-out couch, the glow of the TV casting flickering shadows across the room. The news anchor's voice was steady, reporting the final arrests tied to the trafficking ring. Names of powerful people flashed across the screen: politicians, businessmen, even law enforcement officers. The flash drive had cracked everything wide open, exposing a network that had been hiding in plain sight. It was supposed to feel like closure, like justice had finally been served. But for Jake, it didn't feel over. That last message still haunted him. Some things are better left buried. It wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. The people behind this might have been caught, but their reach was long, and Jake knew better than to think it was truly over. He wasn't the kind of guy who got mixed up in things like this. He was just a garbage man. But somehow, fate had other plans. The woman, whose name he finally learned was Emily, had been relocated under protective custody. She'd given her full statement to the police, detailing everything she knew, which in truth wasn't much. She'd stumbled into the situation just like Jake had. All she wanted was to protect the baby, the innocent little girl who had unknowingly become the key to unraveling a massive criminal empire. Jake visited the hospital one last time to see the baby before she was moved to a safe location. She was asleep in the crib, tiny fingers curled into a fist, her chest rising and falling with each soft breath. Looking at her, it was hard to imagine the danger she'd been in, the lengths people had gone to keep her hidden, or to silence her existence altogether. As Jake stood by the crib, one of the nurses approached. She smiled warmly, recognizing him from the day everything unfolded. "She's lucky you were there," the nurse said softly. Jake nodded, his throat tight. "I think I was the lucky one." He left the hospital with a strange sense of peace, knowing the baby was safe, at least for now. But the message still gnawed at him, a constant reminder that the people behind this mess weren't all behind bars. Some of them were still out there, watching, waiting. Back on his garbage route, things slowly returned to normal, or at least as normal as they could be after something like that. The routine was comforting in a way. The hum of the truck, the rhythmic clatter of bins being emptied, the familiar faces of neighbors waving as he passed. But Jake wasn't the same. He saw things differently now. The world wasn't just black and white, good and bad. There were shadows in between, places people didn't see, or didn't want to see. One morning, as he was finishing up his route, he found a small note tucked under the windshield wiper of his truck. His heart skipped a beat as he unfolded it, half expecting another threat. But it wasn't. "Thank you for not looking the other way." Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his pocket. Maybe things weren't wrapped up as neatly as he'd hoped, but sometimes doing the right thing meant stepping into the mess, even when it wasn't your problem to begin with. Driving off to his next stop, Jake realized something important. Life doesn't always give you a choice about the trouble you stumble into, but it does give you a choice about how you handle it. And sometimes, just sometimes, even a garbage man can be a hero.